to this webinar. A few brief words by way of introduction. She's currently at IIM Ahmedabad in the Public Systems Group. So she spent much of her career at IIT Delhi as a public intellectual, also involved in policy thinking regarding social justice. She's published extensively, both academic as well as through non-academic outlets. She's been part of several initiatives within and outside of government for changing the nature of development interventions. She's been particularly associated with the flagship programs of NAREGA and the PDS, but several others. The general bent of her work is to emphasize state welfare programs and the situations of individuals and families at the socioeconomic margins, as well as community participation. Today's talk on the ethics of RCTs is important for two reasons. One, because RCTs, from being simply a tool, in a short span of time have taken on hegemonic qualities and started displacing other ways of knowledge creation and also policy understanding. Two, surprisingly little has been discussed regarding the ethics of RCTs, especially in the development as opposed to the medical RCT literature. Certainly not only by proponents, but even to some extent, even among critics. So I think this is a particularly important topic with less done than one would normally assume, the ethics of RCTs. So with all that said, on behalf of CDS, welcome to Reetika to this webinar. She will speak for about an hour and we will go on to questions and discussions. Hopefully we'll have about half an hour of that following her presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me, and just a very quick correction. Actually, I moved back to IIT Delhi after 2 years at IIM Ahmedabad this May, so I'm back in my old home.
Sorry, what?
It's fine. Also, like you said, much of my work has actually been on social policy. But I thought perhaps once in a while it's good to get out of one's comfort zone and be a little bit brave and talk about other things as well. These thoughts have been kind of building up for a while now, and then of course I wrote something in Hindi last year soon after the Nobel Prize was given, and I should say right at the beginning that a lot of this work is in a sense new, but also not so new because it's based on discussions with others, especially Jean and I have been sharing notes. And in fact, I think there's a lot of overlap between what he has said a little bit about ethics and what is in the pipeline in terms of what he has also. So with that caveat, maybe I should just go for it. I'll just share my screen in a second. Okay, so I think this should be working now.
Yes, it's working.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So what are RCTs? I'm guessing most people are aware, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I don't do any RCTs myself. We do very different kind of field studies. I suppose the common meeting ground is that both involve quite a lot of field work and primary data collection. But the simple idea behind RCTs is that you want to cleanly be able, it's an old economics obsession, is that you want to identify causal effects. And this pursuit in economics has taken on many different fads, I like to say. So starting with instrumental variables being a way of cleanly identifying causality. Other econometrics tools were developed and became popular. So difference in difference, regression discontinuity, etc. And over a period of time, most were seen as not being good enough. And RCTs then is an idea that's borrowed from, like you said, the medical discipline, medical research. And the idea is that you take a population that is similar on all parameters, and one the experimental group gets the intervention and the control group doesn't get it. So these are subsets of a population that is otherwise supposed to be similar. And then if this intervention group exhibits any particular kind of behavior, then you can say that it was because of the intervention. That's the causality part that you see these. So Angus has this really nice, I mean, he didn't use the image, I'm using the image. And that, you know, the big selling point or the big innovation or as far as RCTs are concerned over other methods of establishing causality is that it does it relatively cleanly. And he talks about this Rube Goldberg machine, which has this very convoluted kind of mechanism. You must have seen images of this elsewhere also. Is the sound all right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the sound is all right. The slides are not moving, so you could.
Oh, so are you not seeing the Rube Goldberg machine?
No.
Are you just seeing the title page?
Yes, only the title page and half the page, not the full screen.
That's weird because here it says you are sharing. Wait a second. Let me just try, yeah? I'll stop sharing and share again. So it says share screen and share application. Let me try application because earlier I was sharing screen. Is it moving now?
Yes, now we are on the second screen. I mean that cartoon, Goldberg.
Yeah, fine. Okay, so I think when
Can you
I
make
go
it full
to,
screen? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think when I do that is when I lose it. Is it moving?
I mean, we are now on the second one.
Okay, fine. All right. So as far as RCTs are concerned, there is quite a rich literature and even debate, I would say, on the methodological limitations, even though it has often been, sold as being, better than all the other methods. If you don't mind, I'm just going to ask the people who are in my corridor to speak a bit softly because they're really loud. I don't know if it's disturbing you. Just give me a second. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so as far as the methodological limitations are concerned, there is a very rich literature, and I'm not going to be going over that at all, except to mention a few of the things that have been debated. One is the concern with external validity, that if something works in a particular setting, what guarantee is there that it'll also work in other settings. The other one is that it focuses on the average treatment effect and how useful or interesting is the average treatment effect as far as policy recommendations are concerned. Because at least in development economics, you're often interested in perhaps bringing up the extreme values to the average. So if you're only focusing your attention on average treatment effect, it's not necessarily very useful. Then there's this question of balance. Like I said initially, you're you're taking a population which is supposed to be similar on all the other parameters, except the fact that one gets the intervention. But actually, if you see a lot of papers and what you balance the two populations on is very much the decision of a researcher. And as with every other technique, there is always this problem of omitted variables or things that you cannot measure. So yes, you can establish balance on the variables that you're measuring and the variables that you think might be of interest, but that's not necessarily the full picture as is often made out to be. So like I said, many people have been writing on it. Chris Parrott, Nancy Cartwright with Angus Deaton, Lance Pritchett has written, Martin Revalio, and many others. What I do want to talk about is some of the, what I've put everything under ethical concerns. And these are the sorts of ethical concerns that I'll talk about today. So the first one is the legality of some of these interventions. Another is a question of transparency and accountability. The third is related to the costs of doing RCTs. Fourth, sometimes the treatment of rights-bearing human beings as mere experiment subjects. Then there's this problem of, the inherent, if not explicitly stated, there is this implicitly accepted hierarchy of evidence, and certain forms of evidence are privileged over others. So like quantitative over qualitative. And then within quantitative now, RCT is sitting right at the top, as they said in the introduction, having a hegemonic position. The next one that is also a matter of concern is the lack of engagement from those who do RCTs on some of these ethical questions that have been raised here and there, but there hasn't been a real response, and I'll talk about that in some detail. The other one is what I call what they find and what they say. So I feel that sometimes the results as projected in popular discussion and debate are not fully communicating the complexities of the findings of the RCT research itself. And then finally, this question of power in all of this. So let me just start one by one. And what I do is, I should say that this is not meant to be a full review of the RCT literature. These may be like a tiny fraction of the RCTs that are carried out. I focus primarily on RCTs that are conducted in India. But even if it is one or two RCTs that run foul of, what we might think of as being ethically important, it is still something that should receive adequate attention because human subjects are involved. Now, as far as RCTs, just before going into all this, as far as RCTs are concerned, what happened is that the technique developed in the field of medical research, and that history also I'm not an expert on, but the Belmont report is the report that is used as the framework which determines do's and don'ts when human subjects are involved in your experimental work. And this is used, I think, across fields, not just in medical research, but has also been borrowed by development economics. And I mean, if you go through these concerns, I think the problem appears to be, this is like a broader point, sort of something perhaps I'll come back to at the end, is that the Belmont report is in some ways inadequate, an inadequate framework for doing RCTs in development economics. And two, even with its inadequacies, I feel that sometimes the three principles of the Belmont report are not necessarily always honored by the RCTs that we have seen. So one, of course, is that some interventions that have taken place actually are the intervention is illegal. Yeah, so paying a bribe, that's been done at least twice in two RCTs. One was paying a bribe to get a driving license, and I think this is an RCT that Jean has written about, and the kinds of ethical concerns that would raise. Not just, I mean, one is the illegality associated with paying a bribe, but also when you're paying a bribe for getting a driving license, which you may end up giving to somebody who's not qualified to drive, and what that person might end up doing on the road. And then the other bribe-related RCT was in Delhi, where two political scientists, they wanted to see how effective the Right to Information Act would be to to get people their entitlements to which they are entitled anyway. And so they said, okay, we'll have these different arms of the intervention. In one case, we'll file an RTI application. In another case, get a letter of recommendation from an NGO. And in one case, we will pay a bribe. And they actually include a very long discussion, 3 pages long, on the ethics of paying a bribe. But somehow in the end, they managed to convince themselves and their IRB, the Internal Review Board, which is supposed to evaluate these interventions and give clearance because it involves human subjects. And after that, since the paper was published, not the editors of the journal as well as the reviewers of their paper. So that's another one. Then there was an RCT in Udaipur where because nurses' attendance rates were very low, they said that we'll introduce biometric attendance or something, and those who don't meet a certain benchmark, those nurses will have their salaries docked. Now, is that legal or not? Is it allowed by the rules? We don't know. And is it okay for somebody to just come and say that, you know, this is what we're going to do? One very recent one, which has been very troubling for many, and it will come up again, is the wage experiment in Odisha, which Ankur Sareen from IIM Ahmedabad has written about in great detail, where the authors wanted to study what effect so they wanted to study whether laborers collude with, they call it collude, as Jean said, actually it should be called solidarity, collude with each other at the labor naka, at a chowk, these labor markets that spring up in urban centers, to prevent wages from falling below a certain benchmark, like a reservation. They have their own system of determining a reservation wage, and then they don't let it fall below that. But in this intervention, what the authors did is they went there and they made an offer, and then they would take one of the laborers aside and say to that laborer that, look, we'll pay you a lower wage, will you accept it? And we won't tell the others that you have broken your promise to them, you know, the wage that you had decided to. So not only is it, as it is, I think the reservation wages at these nakas are below the minimum, statutory minimum wage, but for somebody to go and bargain them down even further, I think is another kind of, so we'll come back to that in a little while. So the question here is that, you know, it's true that in some cases law, I'm not saying laws are sacrosanct and should never be questioned. We have lots of laws now that we are questioning all the time. But first of all, these laws are not in that category, but also, you know, it's one thing for citizens to engage in, say, civil disobedience and question laws, but quite another for researchers to go in and to play around with that legal framework. Yeah, so in a sense, something that is supposed to put limits on our behavior is treated as secondary to research concerns. The second thing that I wanted to highlight is the accountability factor. Now, many interventions, or often, or some interventions, end up having unintended outcomes. All RCTs, by and large, are undertaken with the intention of improving outcomes. Yeah, so it might be that you want to improve attendance of nurses, or you know, you want to improve teacher attendance or learning outcomes, etc. But your intervention may end up working itself out in a way that was not anticipated before. And so here are a few examples of when that happened. In the nurses study that I mentioned a little while ago, the delays, the number of exempt days, I think that's a mistake. The number of exempt days increased, and basically the nurses' attendance rates went down. They were already low. I think they were at about 33%. And in the initial few weeks or so of the intervention, there was an improvement. But after that, they crashed to around 25%. And even after this attendance requirement was taken away, attendance didn't come back to the pre-intervention levels. In an experiment in Bihar, and this is another one that Jean has written about, I don't know if it's the one that's already out or that's in the pipeline. The intervention was made to reduce delays in wage payments. And what ended up happening is that the delays increased. Under NREGA, there is a clause that says that laborers, if they are not paid within 15 days, which is the 14 days, which is the stipulated norm, then they are entitled to a compensation. This experiment did not even build in a budget for a compensation because, like I said, it was an unintended consequence, but certainly no compensation was made. And then, of course, there are even more troubling things about this RCT, which is that in this particular case, the RCT team had as a co-PI and co-author the Rural Development Secretary of Bihar state government. So the person whose job it was to be a circuit breaker. Yeah, when there are unintended outcomes, I think the Belmont report calls it adverse events, then there has to be some kind of check and balance. And in this particular case, it would have to be somebody like the bureaucrat in charge, because this was an experiment that was being done in collaboration with the Bihar government. But that person was made a co-author and co-PI, and of course, nothing. This intervention was not stopped in time. In Jaipur, in another.
Sorry to interrupt, Reetika. I think the slides are not moving.
Again?
Yeah.
Are you not on the accountability slide?
No, no. I think we are still on the second. Yeah, now it's moved.
Yeah, so I think when I move to the slide mode and do it full screen, that's when it stops working.
Right. Now
So
it has
I'll
moved
continue
to
to
legality.
keep it like this.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So the third experiment, which again raises questions of accountability, is this drunk driving experiment with the police in Jaipur, where the police were told that if they performed adequate checks, which is basically if they performed their duty, then they would be given a plum posting. Now, so they wanted to see if incentives work. And indeed, they found that the outcomes were as expected, that when policemen were given these offers or promises of better postings, then they were performing their duty better. But it isn't obvious from the paper, and this is sort of a gray area where clarifications would be and more transparency would be helpful, is to what extent is the improved performance of policemen at the cost of harassment of innocent citizens on the road, right? That because you know that you're going to get a reward, you'll check many more people, but are you in the bargain then encouraging police to harass anyone who's going by on the road? So what is sometimes, they say, in the case for instance of the NREG wage study, they said even the government doesn't pay a compensation when wages are delayed. So why should we be concerned? But I feel that's not an adequate response at all, because one, two wrongs don't make a right. But two, we know that accountability mechanisms are poor across the board in India. But what you're doing is you're actually weakening them even further. And what's troubling is that the bureaucrat who participated and was co-PI in the Bihar experiment is lauded by the authors in another paper. Yeah, and the Kerala bureaucrats who didn't cooperate with the RCT team, they are really talked down and, in a very derogatory kind of way in that paper. So the signals are all wrong, right? You're condoning this weak accountability mechanism and also kind of giving a pat on the back to behavior that doesn't necessarily deserve that pat. The next concern, of course, is that they're very expensive. The costs involved are pretty high. So the data is not very easy to come by. And it was compiled by, like I said, with the help of Ananyaji, and we've tried to put together some numbers at least. And so I can give the example of one RCT where which cost a few, I think like $200,000 is the amount, which is the Aadhaar-based biometric attendance experiment in Jharkhand. That RCT more or less confirms the result of a research field study that Jean and Anmol and I had done with lots of student volunteers around almost exactly the same time. And our RCT was, our field study was like 2 or 3 lakh rupees. Yeah, so to learn the same thing, you end up spending a lot more money and also spending a lot of time. But for instance, in Nigeria, this is, just to give you a sense of how expensive it is, the intervention was funded by DFID, and 12% of the total budget was spent on doing this monitoring and evaluation. Yeah, this is a pretty large chunk. The second cost-related question that, which is sort of going off in a slightly different tangent, but is still relevant and related to the question of accountability that I just highlighted before, is who is funding this research? So again, this is based on the database that we're trying to put together. There is a whole range of funders, no doubt. The NIH and NSF are big funders, but a lot of this funding is also coming from philanthropic donors, yeah, and bilaterals as well. And so to the extent that research agenda is now being driven by these bodies, what does it mean for independent research agendas being drawn up and implemented? And I can say more about this as we go along. And then the third, perhaps, this is something that I'm not sure of myself, is what is the breakup of these budgets? How much of it is money actually spent on the intervention? How much of it is going on other things? And what are these interventions actually? Is it fortification or is it expensive cameras? And the reason why I thought perhaps it's worth talking about is that, in this very early experiment in Udaipur, where they gave cameras to teachers who taught in non-formal education, in non-formal schools, at that time, these digital cameras were not cheap. And they were being used in settings where the schools were bare-bone schools, right? They were basically perhaps not even a proper infrastructure for a classroom, etc. So in that kind of setting, to put a digital camera that allows the teacher to take a picture in the morning and afternoon, okay, it might increase the number of hours that the teacher spends there. But there's of course the additional question of what did the teacher do in that time. But the question that I want to focus on right now is it just something you feel icky about? We live with a lot of inequality anyway. So I suppose you could say that, okay, this is just a reflection of society as, as we know it. But is this something to talk about? And it'll be nice to hear what people say. Actually, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is also to get feedback about whether I'm just like going down a hole and missing something important, or are these really valid concerns that should be aired more widely? So like I said, that a lot of the funding is coming from philanthropists. And then it's not surprising that, Omidyar network, which is invested in a particular kind of world view and also has for-profit investments in some of these sectors, is funding a biometric smart card study. Similarly, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded the big Aadhaar-based biometric authentication study. Yeah, so when philanthropists are entering the picture, they're also likely pushing some part of their own agenda. And what does that mean for having an independent research agenda? Even within universities, that space appears to be shrinking in the US. The next concern, I think, is again quite important, appears to be quite important to me, is when rights-bearing human beings are just treated or mere experimental subjects. So the idea is that, okay, you have a certain research question, but how far can you go with that research question without trampling on people's rights? So this Nigeria experiment, every once in a while I have some other example, but in the fuller paper I have other examples which are not listed here. So in Nigeria, this intervention was a nutrition-based intervention where it was a life-saving thing, and we don't know whether the rollout was held up or delayed or randomized for that matter in order to serve the needs of an RCT. Yeah, so these are details that would be useful to have. This is something actually that Martin Revallion has written about a couple of times at least, is that, okay, you might say that the government has already taken this decision, so why not just randomize the rollout so that we can also simultaneously study? It seems like a win-win situation. But actually, some of these things, it doesn't make sense to roll it out. Yeah, and one of those things would be this biometrics rollout wherever. I mean, I've put down Jharkhand, but it could be, any technological intervention where if there was no RCT on the scene, then the government would have said, okay, let's try it out at Ranchi. Let's try it out in the block that's nearest to Ranchi district headquarters, because we'll be able to monitor it. Yeah, so they might have taken that kind of approach rather than just randomly picking out villages. And actually, one of the villages that we surveyed in the Aadhaar study in Jharkhand of the PTS was literally on the border in Simdega, on the border with Orissa, and that village didn't have electricity. So the PTS dealer used to cross the river to go to Orissa, where there was electricity, to charge her POS machine, her point of sale machine, in order for it to work. Of course, there was no signal, but at least in offline mode, after having charged it in this manner, she was able to carry out the transaction. So when you randomize certain interventions, it's it has implications for people. They may not get their ration, and in Jharkhand, as far as this Aadhaar is concerned, for different reasons, Aadhaar has been instrumental, or at least one of the factors in causing the death of several people. Many people, about 10 odd people, have died in Jharkhand because they were not able to get their rations on time or at all. So program placement is dictated by the RCT rather than the need of people. And then if the scaling is held up on account of the needs of an RCT, then those are the kinds of things that one worries about, reducing human beings just to experimental. So that's what I mean by that. Similarly, the wages study in Odisha, where they were bargaining down wages, that seems somewhat troubling. And there have been some RCTs where they have tried to influence people's participation in protests I think it happened in Hong Kong, where they tried to encourage or discourage people from participating in protests in order to study something. Yeah, so there's a whole range of these interventions where you might wonder about this question. The next one on my list is, to what extent is this, the popularity of RCTs distorting research agendas. So one concern here is that if you're a young economist, even say in a US department or even in India, and looking for tenure, then you need to have publications in a particular kind of journal. Now, so what do? You, at least some people, will look at what is it that gets published, and you kind of reverse engineer your research question and research agenda to publishability of that work. And what's happened, of course, so this is a wider problem in the field of economics, is that it's getting more and more quantitative. But even within that, what has happened in the recent past is that there is less and less space for other or it appeared at one point that you could only get published if you were doing an RCT. And so then what happens is that even questions that don't necessarily need an RCT to be answered, research questions, will also try to go that way. And I would say that the use of Aadhaar in Jharkhand is a reasonably good example of that. That of course our sample sizes were much smaller, but we were able to do a fairly careful and rigorous study. And in the end, it turns out that the results from a very expensive RCT and a not so expensive field study are more or less similar. The other thing, of course, is that sometimes these RCTs end up asking very strange, seemingly very strange questions. So one example which has been beaten to death is the one in China where children with poor eyesight were given reading glasses, and there's a huge amount of literature, I think, on the ethical concerns around there. There's another one which let me explain, and then you can tell me whether you think it's a banal question or not. Again, this is something, it's more like to get feedback than anything else. So in Gujarat, the High Court had said that industrial units will have to monitor their emissions. Yeah, and then when the Gujarat state government issued an order to operationalize that judgment, they allowed firms, industrial units, to get their emission levels audited by a third party. And what happened, and when I explain this to people, I think for many people, the obvious thing is that the third party can easily be given extra money to make a report that would be acceptable. So this RCT wanted to actually check whether that is true, and they brought in another layer of checks and balances, like a third party, to see what was happening. And indeed, what they found is that many industrial units, in their emission audit reports, were showing levels of emissions that were just below the cutoff. Now, again, this was an expensive RCT, and perhaps a question that could have been answered in a different way without getting into this very elaborate and expensive method. Another related question is that RCTs, they have the real strength is that they're able to kind of focus on one causal factor and establish that. Now, the fact is that many of these questions, actually, you will not get a full understanding. What you need is a fuller understanding that having established that causality in a very microscopic manner, intellectually might be interesting, but in terms of policy implications may not be that interesting. And there's a 2016 paper by Sunil Kumar, who's Mitra at King's College London, who looks at two experiments which examine precisely this question. So the teacher absenteeism experiment in Udaipur and the Bal Sakhi program, which was in 2 cities, including Baroda, where an extra teacher was made available to students who were not performing as well as the others in their class. And the thing is that both absenteeism and learning outcomes, they're not just a matter of that one intervention, right? The whole structure is so complex that you would miss out on an important understanding if you try to do it in this very microscopic way. So Deaton, of course, really, a lot of these things are interrelated also. So if it was an inexpensive method, then maybe focusing in this very microscopic way would have been all right. But every now and then I have quotes from Deaton, because he has already visited, he has already written about some of these issues, perhaps not in as much detail and with not as many examples. So he says randomization, after all, is random. And searching for solutions at random is inefficient because it considers so many relevant possibilities, right? So this kind of unthinking way of sometimes unthinking way of asking questions, you really do wonder where this whole research is going. A sort of related thing to the hierarchy and and therefore the distortion of research agendas in terms of methodologies is that, you know, I mean, they may not be in writing, but the attitude is definitely that other forms of evidence are not evidence. Now that is changing, thankfully. But, you know, there is this problem that you can only accept evidence if it has been generated by an RCT. And at one point, actually, this was just after the Nobel was announced last year, one of the senior affiliates, had to issue a clarification that they never use gold standard. Actually, it turned out that, in fact, on their website, this word was there, and it was removed soon after she tweeted this, and it was pointed out. And as Angus has written, that, you know, this imposition of a hierarchy of evidence is both dangerous and unscientific. And then he elaborates a little bit. Yeah, so this creation of a cult, I think now that it's perhaps, you know, that fad is going away, and there's another fad on the rise, by the way, which is machine learning and big data, etc. And maybe some years down the line, we'll be discussing, you know, the kind of headiness associated with machine learning techniques and why it was wrong. Okay, so the next one is this lack of engagement. Like I said, few people have been raising even the ethical, on the methodological issues, there has been some back and forth. As far as, so like, you know, for instance, when questions of external validity were raised, what they started doing is they started doing the experiments on scale. So if you look at the earlier RCTs, the sample sizes are quite small. And because these questions of external validity arose in the methodological literature, they started collaborating with state governments. In the case of India, I don't know the other places that well, to do these things on scale. Now, as far as the ethical questions are concerned, there hasn't been that much, very little, I would say. One of the things that they often say is that, you know, this is not only an RCT, this is not something that comes up only in RCTs, this is a wider concern with doing research or whatever it is. So, so like if you raise this question of accountability or non-payment of compensation for NREGA wage delays, even the government doesn't do it. Or if you raise the question of bribes, that, you know, Indian society, and this has been discussed in that Peshakin and Pinto paper where they paid bribes for ration cards, that, you know, it's happening anyway in society. But I would say that two wrongs don't make a right, that in fact the role of researchers should be to raise the standard, not to lower, you know, social norms is to raise the bar rather than lower it. Sometimes there's a tendency to trivialize some of these concerns. So this is in the context of external validity, where, you know, they say, okay, now we did it in Bihar, now let's do it in Kenya or wherever. Then there's this concern of, which I haven't talked about earlier, is that one important thing in the Belmont report is that they're supposed to ensure that there is informed consent. Now, when you're randomizing in a way where entire blocks or villages are included or excluded from the intervention, then the participants very often don't even know that they're part of an RCT, right? So where does the question of getting consent even arise? And at one meeting, I actually raised that question, and they said, no, but every participant that we interview, you know, when the forms are filled, data is collected, we have consent from them. But that's a very different kind of consent. Yeah, what we are talking about, what the Belmont report says, that if somebody is included in an intervention or excluded from it, I suppose, they're supposed to be informed about it and they have to then take a decision. But none of that is happening, at least in the RCTs where entire blocks or villages are included or excluded. And this is not something that has been addressed so far. And then there are some so one is this whataboutery thing that, you deflect attention saying these things are already happening, so we shouldn't be held responsible or, ask these questions. But there are other areas where these ethical concerns only arise with an RCT, right? So would it be okay for, and others have said this before me, like, if I go to America and I go to Princeton and I tell them I'm going to randomize your wages depending on the number of hours you come into office at university, nobody is going to let me do that, right? But in the Indian case, in Odisha, they were happily able to randomize or reduce the wages that were offered to these people. And similarly, even the bribe giving thing would fall into this kind of category where you actively go and encourage bribe giving. What has happened, this is again staying with the theme of engagement or the lack of it, is that now we don't know for sure when these pages were added, but it appears that some sections are new. And some of those sections relate to ethics and dealing with IRBs. IRBs are the internal review boards that are supposed to give permission for doing RCTs. And actually some of the stuff that I was reading that, and actually some of the stuff that is there is of course very helpful, but some of it is also somewhat troubling, I felt, and I pulled out two of those passages and I'll just read it slowly. So one of them says, the more you are involved in the design, administration, targeting, or any other aspect of the intervention you're studying, the more the intervention falls under the scrutiny of the IRB and your obligation as a researcher. Now this, when I read it, seems to be suggesting to me that they should encourage that the intervention is done by the state government or by the local NGO that they collaborate with, so that their obligations and towards the IRB are reduced, right? So this is sort of using the Belmont report and its requirement as a cover and as a way of actually, so in letter there is compliance, but in spirit there isn't compliance, I would say. Similarly, this other passage, which is quite long, but I think is also worth reading and also getting feedback from later on, because like I said, I'm not always certain that, I'm looking at it right. So note that even if you do not, so this is in dealing with the IRB, like how much should you tell the IRB as far as the risks involved in the intervention are concerned. So it's in that context that this passage was there. Even if you do not identify any risks, IRBs may still ask you to mention risks and benefit in the consent form. For example, by saying there are no risks or benefits to you from the study. There is no need to try and bend over backwards to convince yourself, the IRB or the subjects, that there is absolutely zero risk. Depending on your study population and context, this can make subjects actually more suspicious or at least confused. If there are no risks, and so far the study sounded completely harmless, why is this explicitly mentioned? Thus, on balance, it is actually not necessarily going to reduce participation or harm your relationship with the subjects if you mention small risks. It can help the subjects see that you thought carefully about this and but that there are only the risks that you came up with. So again, this sounds slightly manipulative to me, right? That how do you play the IRB and how do you play your subjects so that you get maximum enrollment? So I do feel that there's like I said at the beginning, the Belmont report is not suitable in its form, and in its as a framework for doing RCTs that of the nature that we have seen in development economics. And then of course even those principles are not necessarily always honored. And I think that it appears that at least sometimes it is used as so it was supposed to be a shield for human subjects when against or from the harms that an RCT might expose them to. Now it has become a shield for the researchers to protect themselves from any questioning, right? So it's you know, you say that, look, we are compliant with the Belmont report, we got IRB approval, and so everything is fine, and that becomes like the final word. But clearly that's not an adequate way to proceed. Then there's the communication part of the story, which is one of the last 2 or 3 points that I wanted to talk about. So what they find and what they say. And Deaton had this really nice quote, which I like to use when I can. So he said, I've often been struck by the contrast between the care that goes into running an RCT and the carelessness that goes into advocating the use of its results. Now, I don't know if some of you have been following this debate with Karthik, Paul, and Sandeep on the Aadhaar biometric RCT that they did in Jharkhand, where, and you know, our data collection was more or less around the same time. But if you read the paper, it's super careful with lots of caveats, with lots of different results. And from that whole gamut of findings that they have, they pick one which, according to us, suits a particular kind of narrative. And so what they find is that corruption didn't go down. In fact, it increased a little bit, I think. Exclusion increased. But the way the results are projected in the opinion pieces that are written, say, in Hindustan Times, or even in a reader-friendly version, say, on Ideas for India, it's presented as a trade-off that, you know, you can reduce corruption, but when you try to reduce corruption, you increase exclusion. But this isn't really the crux of their findings in the paper, right? So there is this kind of cherry picking or selective reporting, or just amplifying a certain result and muting another one, which has serious implications, you know, if you're doing policy related work. And what was even more interesting in this particular example, and this we have written about in Ideas for India, is that there was the paper, then there is the shorter reader friendly version of it. And then when that reader friendly version of it is circulated by email to a whole bunch of people, the covering email actually has a very different message from the reader friendly version, right? So there are 2 levels at which the message is kind of getting diluted or distorted. Something similar happened with another experiment that was done in 3 union territories, where they wanted to replace PDS rations with cash. So this was Chandigarh, Dadra Nagar Haveli, and Pondicherry. And so, okay, there is the experiment and it's rolled out, and then there's a result. And in the results, they highlight one particular result, which is that over a period of time, people's acceptance of cash as an alternative to food has increased. So in these places, food was supposed to be discontinued and replaced with cash in the bank account. Fair enough. But what actually happened is that in Pondicherry, within 2 or 3 months of this stopping of grain and introduction of cash, people were very angry. And the state government got worried, and they reintroduced food and they stopped the cash. So this already vitiates the RCT, right? Because if the intervention is going back and forth, what do you make of it? But that part of the vitiating of the RCT is not really mentioned except in one passing footnote. You know, that of course in the case of Pondicherry, both the things were continuing, because so what the state government did is there was stop food and give cash. They got worried after a while, so stopped cash and reverted to food. And then they realized that they could give both, because they were now using state resources to give food, And they said, we'll use the National Food Security Act clause, which says you can give cash. So they started giving cash also. And in the end, I don't know what the situation is now, but in that period, there was a time when people were getting both food and cash. This RCT has basically fallen flat, right? It's no longer an RCT. But the results of Pondicherry are clubbed with the other two places and presented without enough of caveating about what happened actually on the ground. So this communication part of it also, I feel that, and this is something that's a wider concern, that when people have power in the system, then they should exercise it a little bit carefully, which is really the last sort of point that I want to make, is that researchers who, if an IIT professor goes to, a rural area, already we get treated with too much deference. But when people from, Ivy League universities, etc., come in and ask for access, they certainly get treated differently. And as soon as, for instance, as soon as the Nobel was around, of course, there was a lot of excitement because one of the Nobel laureates was Indian. And immediately the chief ministers of Delhi and Chhattisgarh were tweeting about how they had either been associated or would like to be associated with them. So this kind of also raises some questions. And the other related kind of thing is that a lot of the journals, which I mentioned before, is that a lot of the journals are controlled or whatever by people who are from that ecosystem. And that also influences other kinds of research. So, I have had this experience when I give this talk, then other economist colleagues in India will egg me on and say, ha, 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 Reetika, go ahead. But they themselves, who have seen things from the inside, may not necessarily be willing to talk because their own papers are going to those journals for review process, etc. So it is an awkward, I feel pretty bad to talk about this. It is a really awkward kind of debate to have, but I also feel that it's at least worth airing some of these thoughts and getting feedback, because the costs are pretty high all around. Yeah, and for me, of course, this Aadhaar is the most pressing kind of example, where the integration of Aadhaar in the PDS has really caused a lot of hardship for poor people, not just in Jharkhand, but all over. And one doesn't have to go to the extreme examples of people having lost their lives, but even just like on a monthly basis, this policy is so foul that people don't know whether their biometrics will work today or not work today. And just to, for somebody's techno utopian fantasy and the inability of researchers to stand up and think independently and speak up, lots of people pay the price. And then I mentioned this example of the Kerala bureaucrats versus the Bihar. The Kerala ones were really derided for ignoring the RCT team, and the Bihar one is a rare creature because he helped them along. Right. So I'm nearly out of time, right? So I thought maybe I should leave you with this little extract from Esther's talk and paper, where she sort of tries to explain why economists make good plumbers. And maybe now I can make it full screen so that now I'm not going to change slides. And then I'm happy to take questions. Is everyone there?
Yeah, we are here.
Okay, and you're awake.
1%.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll just exit this. Shall I do that?
Yeah. Perhaps
Okay.
that. So thank you, Reetika. I think we have a fair amount of time for a discussion. I think you've covered a lot of ground, some of which is not traditionally ethics, but also knowledge creation and so on. So let me just run through the various things I sort of listed among the topics you covered in this. So one is illegality and the incentives to illegality through RCTs, unintended consequences and sort of ignoring the ethics of how to handle that. Huge costs, who is funding the plutocrat philanthropists, rights-bearing individuals as turning into subjects of research, power relations which are inevitable when these kinds of stars enter the field, distortions in the research agenda, what others have called a substitution effect, and a narrowing of the kinds of questions which are asked, coming of cult and a control of the kinds of publications which are possible, the kinds of jobs which are possible, lack of engagement, informed consent, some of the more traditional ethics of field research, and finally communication and sort of disingenuous ways of communication, which is ethically problematic. So I myself have a few questions, but let me just first open it out to the audience. We have over 50 people on the call. So yeah, please, colleagues, if anybody has questions, if you can raise your hand. Well, okay, while people get their thoughts together, maybe one thing I can start off asking is, uh, I think this is an impressive catalog of problems that you're documenting. Would it be worth, at the risk of whataboutery, which you already have pointed out, situating some of these problems in the larger landscape of research in development economics, general sort of positivist social sciences, because many of these, not just things like informed consent, but treating rights-bearing individuals as subjects, lack of engagement, distortions, and so on, are true. So, I mean, would it be fair to say that RCTs represent a sort of culmination of already existing and problematic trends? And some of these are definitely particularly new to RCTs. So I'm wondering whether that kind of distinction is worth making. I understand the whataboutery problem, and the idea is not to go there, but just to say that we have had so many pilot projects in India, interventions, which also have had issues which RCTs also have had in terms of unintended consequences. The run of policy making in government, right, which has nothing to do with RCTs, which many academics also contribute to, right, where some of these issues should also be raised. So in other words, to locate these concerns as in this larger landscape. That's one. And the second is the point you touched on at the very end with this Duflo's economist as plumber business. Perhaps one of the really distinctive features, ethically problematic features, is it's not that other kinds of research don't have hype or don't distort and don't overclaim policy implications, but it seems that increasingly RCTs are marketed as the way to lay the pipes, as Duflo puts it in that the plumber paper. And as you quoted Deaton, that the carelessness, the lack of understanding of policy practice doesn't prevent them from, maybe other kinds of research is a little less bold, in making these connections, and so it's ethically problematic because some of the other things, I think, I mean, the lack of epistemic humility is not peculiar to RCTs. I think so that was my first comment. It might be worth locating this in that larger troubling landscape. Yeah, I'll stop.
So, I mean, it's not really a question, I'm guessing, but rather reflection. See, I think it is true. I have friends who are not economists, who are, social scientists from other disciplines, and also from the humanities, right? And they're constantly reminding me as in the economist hat, that you people have, you have, economists have this hegemonic tendency, the word that you used. And this has been there for a very long time, right? Thankfully, one of the degrees I acquired was a development studies degree, where I was told that there's a problem with the economist's way of thinking, or problem, no, there's, they need to be a little bit careful. But I feel, so it is true that it is a general economics problem, at least, and this positivist kind of way of doing things. But I feel that we have to raise it, whether it is in economics in general or RCTs in particular. We must say and remind ourselves. I was reminded repeatedly, and I hope that as a result of that, I am more responsible in my, or at least reflecting a little bit on my actions and ways of doing research. It's not that we just don't go unthinkingly, even though I'm sure we do things that, if others were asked, they would find problems with, right? But at least we are willing to listen, and if somebody told us, I feel we would change our ways if we agreed or argue again. But that's not happening. That's one part of it. The other part is that there is a particular way in which power is resting with economists in, these countries, right? As an IIT person, or say as a Delhi School of Economics person, I have more voice in the system than, say, if I was a professor at Maharaja Sayajirao University in Baroda, right? And similarly, the ones who are sitting in the MITs and Princetons and Harvards have, if they make an intervention, if you're a Nobel laureate, you get even more voice. So it is recognizing that you have you are being given extra space, and then saying, okay, I'll use it judiciously, or I'll share it with others. So it's true that it's not only RCTs, it's a wider concern, but both those things to me seem to suggest that we should talk about them more. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Let me just wait to see if others have comments or questions.
Yeah. Can I ask a query of Reetika here?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, Reetika. Ram here. Just a more general thing, sense of history. How did this crossover from medical research to social sciences, or specifically economics? I mean, we've heard about the Nairobi study, but how did it cross over and become institutionalized? Any idea about that? I mean, so much so that it's now a central part of development economics.
Right. So I have to say that I wasn't paying that much attention to RCTs that carefully. But I think it was very much Kramer and Esther who thought this was an idea that could be used really well in economics. And indeed, I mean, there are definitely many RCTs. I have obviously picked the ones that were problematic, but in many ways, they have advanced, knowledge creation, understanding, and all of that. So just, I mean, I have to remind myself of that part of it as well. So I think it was very much that group over there that saw the potential. And I think the Udaipur camera study was one of the first ones, or perhaps the first one, where they found interesting results. But the other sort of unrelated thing, I won't go there now, but I'll tell you that, these data collection exercises are so messy on the ground. We do data collection all the time, but when you read the papers, it comes across as just like, very neat, very tight. But if you talk to the RAs who are associated on the ground, they have all kinds of stories to say about how things were messy. But that messiness doesn't always get reported and recorded, or adequately at least. So to answer your question about the crossover, I think it was very much that group, especially Kramer and Esther, and then of course Abhijit Banerjee also, who then developed the kind of theoretical kind of framework as well. I think they have an early handbook or something, and that I think set the, and then they had all these PhD students, and then the money came. I think money was a very important, because they're so expensive, right? So all of those things somehow came together.
Yeah, okay.
May I ask a question, please? Sorry, there are people with their hands up, if you notice.
All right. Oh,
Rohit and Krishna Kumar have been having their hands up for quite some time.
All
if
right.
you let me ask a question after them, I'll be grateful.
Yes, please, Devika, go ahead.
Okay, if Rohit is not asking, then let me ask. Okay, see, I'm just fascinated by this, the fascination with RCTs. So, and I'm trying to think about it in a larger frame, maybe the history of social science, history of economics itself. Because I think economics was always in love with physics in some ways, and trying to mimic physics in a very strong way, because I was quite surprised when I first encountered economics, when I remember, because I saw terms like elasticity, for example, which I had learned as a student of physics. So there's a lot, in some ways, there's a lot that was being borrowed from physics. So now physics, of course, is theoretical physics, pure physics. Now we have reached a stage where we do not really have, pure physics in that sense. Now we really have what is called, a technocratic, a complex, a kind of an industrial scientific complex, where the link between technology and science is so strong that we actually mistake technology for science. I'm just wondering if something like that isn't happening to economics also. So, and this struck me when I read that paper on in which Duflo calls economists plumbers. This eagerness to call economists plumbers. So plumbers are essentially dealers in technology, people who apply technology. So, is this a larger shift happening within economics, by which it's growing closer to technology rather than science itself?
Right. So, so I think, yeah, I mean, the origins of economics were political economy, and it was a very different kind of discipline. And then in the I think it was after the Second World War that this whole mathematization of the discipline really took off. But I think at least some economists who were very much part of that formalizing results and thinking, etc., like even Sam Bowles, I think now they feel that the subject might be losing its essence or something of that sort. So he's very much involved in the core project, which is trying to do economics slightly differently and develop a different textbook than the Samuelson or Mankiw model. That's one. So I think the discipline has had different trajectories, and the mathematization or formalism and all of that is certainly part of the story. And then I think this is a point that Jean makes elsewhere, is that on whose behalf are economists speaking, right? Are they speaking on behalf of industry? Are they speaking on behalf of the rural people? Are they speaking on behalf of government? And depending on that, you might get different messages and different policy advice. So I think there is a lot of reflection within, like Hausman, he's doing economic philosophy. He has also written about these issues. But certain kinds of people get amplified and popularized and, become public intellectuals. Which is also now a double-edged sword. So I was a bit like, oh no, he's calling me a public intellectual. So yeah, I think that power is very attractive, and any concentration of power is leading to these kinds of issues, whether it is the concentration of power within the discipline of economics as far as social sciences are concerned, or of certain universities vis-a-vis others. And this questioning of power, therefore, is quite important, and not allowing it to accumulate like this.
Thank you, Ritika. We'll have Rohit and then Krishna Kumar. Sorry, Rohit and Krishna Kumar, I didn't see your hands up. I'm operating from a phone, but now I've got the hang of it. So Rohit first, please. Rohit, are you there?
Maybe he has to unmute himself.
Can you see if it's a unmuting problem? Or maybe we can switch to Krishna Kumar and then come back to Rohit in the interest of time. Krishna Kumar, please.
Rohit can type his question meanwhile.
Yeah.
I keep an eye on the chat box.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, it was just a tangential thing which Ritika was speaking in the context of a lecture about machine learning turning out to be a new fad. Of course, it's turned out to be a new fad of sorts, but I found that there are certain studies, for example, a study which I read by Senthil Mullenathan was trying to draw attention about the sort of serious discrimination which could happen even when we have a machine learning environment of delivery of credit. So, in fact, if processes in the economy are becoming technologically based or technologically rigorous as methods and processes of delivery, then unless a critical and creative engagement with that is done, possibly we would not be able to be critical about it also. That is exactly what I read into Senthil Mullenathan's study about discrimination of Afro-Americans in the credit market, even when the processes were had little bit less to do with, say, the bank employees or so on. So I would like possibly a comment from the part of Ritika in this regard.
Right. No, so I think Sendil's early warnings are very important. So one of the things that he has looked at is this, but he has also looked at discrimination in sentencing using machine learning techniques, and highlighted, what is at fault over there. But the fact is that in India right now, you can put big data and machine learning in a proposal and you'll get money pretty quickly. But the domain expertise in looking at that big data, even if it is actually big, first of all, nobody knows what big data is. No, it's not, it's a very amorphous kind of concept. But the fact is that now it's become a fad amongst funders. And so now putting big data machine learning gives you money. And then what went into the black box, as Sendil says, you'll only later on learn. So it is true that what is very important is that people who know the techniques are the, who also engage with the critical part of it. And thankfully, there are plenty, I mean, at least a few that I am aware of, even within computer science at Princeton, for instance. There's a computer scientist called Arvind Narayanan, who is very mainstream computer science researcher, but is one of the most important voices on privacy and data security and all the safeguards that we need in this highly digitized kind of world.
Yeah. Okay.
I think Rohit said that. Yeah, Rohit said he's having difficulty. So Rohit, if you can just type out your question until you get audio. Meanwhile, other. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Reetika, for a very insightful presentation. I'm a second-year master's student at CDS, and as a former JPAL RA, I have completely relate to a lot of your concerns. My question relates to some of the problematic or like ethically problematic RCTs that you mentioned, like the Hong Kong protest one. There was a randomizing religion one in Indonesia, and then the worst of it, like cutting water access to urban poor in Kenya. So post a lot of these ethics debates that happen a lot much on Twitter, there was a call put out by the Innovation for Poverty Action for structured ethics appendices. That's not mandatory, but voluntary for like publication, working papers, etc. And there is also a simultaneous change in the discipline towards more computational replicability and those kind of things. So there is pre-registration and all of those things that serve to kind of limit the kind of fraud that you can do later. So how do you view these kind of developments? Do you potentially see that these actual reflections on scarcity, what will happen if the RCT had not happened? Do these actually reflect in practice in terms of how they implement it, or is it going to just reflect in just writing the piece of paper? Thank you.
I think that any engagement should be taken in good faith. And I think ultimately, maybe it's just a question of having more humility about what our contribution as researchers or economists is. Forget RCTs or not RCTs. But just being a bit more circumspect and, doing your bit, but also being willing to listen to others. So I think I missed that call. I know about the Nairobi water supply thing, and I thought that was very encouraging, actually, by the way, that within a day, the authors had put out a note on Twitter explaining their position. Some people were convinced by their explanations, others were not. Fair enough, but at least there is an attempt to react. On the other hand, there's also a Twitter thread, which I have in the paper, but I could have pulled it out. But there's somebody who says, look, that every time an RCT is called out on social media, which is where it's often happening, not in the journals. So I think it is important for this debate to move into more formal spaces also. I mean, it's good that social media has opened up this space for some people to air their thoughts. But yeah, so I thought it was encouraging that they immediately reacted. I was saying about the thread, which says that, this is the sequence of event. Bad RCT, calling out on social media, and then you basically just go back, repeat the same loop, but there's no remedial measure. So I think that in terms of remedial measures, we have to think beyond the Belmont report. I think that's quite important. And if one wants to continue to do RCTs, then have a more suitable framework which adequately takes into account all of these concerns. The other thing is that the IRBs are relying very much on goodwill and self-compliance and trust, which is a good thing. I think it's a good thing because I'm guessing that most RCTs are probably fine from the ethical perspective. But when there are what are called adverse events or these unintended outcomes, then there should be better self-reporting of that. I think that part is missing right now. So the IRBs really need to sit up. For instance, when Ankur Sareen wrote his paper about the Odisha really like shocking experiment, there was no response. And in fact, we were thinking that perhaps we should send a letter to the IRBs involved saying, can you tell us what's going on here? But somebody has to do it.
Santanu has a question in the chat box. I don't know if it's beyond the scope of this, but yeah, he's asking about RCTs in the biological sciences. A more general kind of question.
I think so. I think it's coming from there into these other disciplines, including marketing, psychology, economics. I think in marketing and psychology, they existed even before development economics latched onto it.
Yeah. I have a question, in response to the last question. You mentioned that most RCTs might be ethically okay, right? But the problematic ones, the ones you've identified, are big enough, right, to be of real concern. But just this idea that it is possible to run an ethically okay RCT, right? Some people might take issue even with that, because in the medical RCT literature, they have coined this term called equipoise. Which is that, right? I think you implicitly sort of alluded to that. The idea that we can, and it's basically taking some kind of consequentialist utilitarian framework to say that we can justify some kind of trampling on ethics, let's say by denying the control group something, or by unleashing some illegality temporarily, if the knowledge gained can later be put in some kind of vague utilitarian way for greater social good, right? If one comes to that kind of understanding, yes, but others would say that no, it's wrong to apply a utilitarian consequentialist framework, which would make any RCT problematic because it consists of denying, right, deliberately denying, playing God, things like that. So, yeah, any thoughts on that aspect?
So I see, think about that Gujarat pollution experiment, right? There was no real intervention involved which gave something to some and didn't give to the others. In that sense, it was okay, I would say. I just felt that that didn't require an expensive RCT to learn what they did, right? So what did they do? They said, we'll take your audit reports, which you have got, your emission audit reports, and we will have it verified by our own auditor, right? So there's no problem. If they were doing something, we went and double checked that. And so I feel like ethically, I would say that that doesn't trouble me in the sense of this equipoise principle. But what I felt over there perhaps is that you didn't need to spend so much money to learn this, and you may have been able to do it if you weren't so fixated on RCTs, then you might have been able to learn the same thing at a lower cost and faster, maybe even.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. I think we are getting to 5 o'clock. So on my part, let me just thank you, Reetika, and to everybody, and I'll just pass it on to the director, Professor Mani, for concluding remarks. Over to you, Professor Mani.
Yeah. I just would like to thank Professor Reetika Khera for giving such a wonderful lecture. And about a few months ago, when I contacted her, she was very willing to come and give a talk. And she has great regard for CDS. And we look forward to having her in our midst when in-person activity resumes. I hope sometime next year. Okay. And so thank you, Professor Khera, for such a nice talk.
Yeah.
I also thank Suraj, our resident expert on RCTs. And Suraj has been very helpful for us to understand this concept. And in fact, he's in the process of writing a larger paper, which he gave a lecture on it at CDS some time ago. And in fact, I am expecting that paper from him fairly soon. Okay. So thank you very much, Professor Khera and Dr. Jacob, for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And I thank everyone for attending this. And our next lecture is next Friday at 3:30. And it's going to be on something similar, which is on corruption in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which with a specific reference to Karnataka. So that's next Friday, the 11th at 3:30 p.m. Thank you once again. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.